Chapter 1. Will Darling was outnumbered by books. It hadn't always felt this way. When he'd first visited his uncle at Darling's Used and Antiquarian, he'd simply thought, that's a lot of books. And when he'd started helping here, they were just work. As he took over the running of the place in his uncle's last illness, though, he became increasingly aware of them looming around him, full of knowledge and secrets and lies. So much that when Uncle William had died, Will remembered an ancient piece of lore about bees, and he'd cleared his throat and told the books, he's gone. He was dead, and Will, his sole heir, had inherited Darling's Used and Antiquarian, the premises on May's Buildings off St. Martin's Lane, the goodwill, such as it was, and the stock. He was master of an entire building, with a shop floor, 2 upstairs rooms, and a cubbyhole at the ground floor back, which was all the space his uncle had allowed for human life. He'd have Uncle William's savings too, once probate had been sorted out. And he owned a lot of books, although just now and then, when it got dark and the shelves loomed over him, he got the feeling that they owned him. He occupied some of the extremely long periods when nobody came into the shop by trying to calculate how many volumes his uncle had stuck him with, and had concluded it could easily be 40,000. He had yet to find an inventory, and was increasingly convinced the old bugger had kept his records in his head. So here he was, at the shop desk, with books double-stacked in the floor-to-ceiling shelves that turned the room into a maze, books piled on every flat surface and against every vertical one, books half obscuring the windows. Bloody books. The place reeked of old paper over the fainter odours of damp, dust and rodents. He'd put down traps, checked the walls, and taken a broom to what floor was visible, as well as to the accumulating cobwebs on the fog-stained ceiling. It had had very little effect. He'd probably get used to the smell of second-hand books one day, just stop noticing it, and then he'd be doomed. On that gloomy thought, he swung his feet up onto his desk and leaned back in his chair. Uncle William had spent good money on this chair once, and though the red leather was cracked, it was still comfortable. That was good enough for Will. He was damned lucky to be here, even if he lived in danger of being crushed by a book landslide. Will had gone to the war at 18, and come back 5 years later to find himself useless and unwanted. In Flanders he'd been a grizzled veteran, a fount of professional expertise who knew the ropes and had seen it all. Back in Blighty he'd become a young man again, one with little training and no experience. He'd been apprenticed to a joiner before the war, but that felt like decades ago. All he was good at now was killing people, which was discouraged. Britain was full of men like him, trying to find something to do in a country that had managed perfectly well without them. He'd gone home first, but his mother had died from the Spanish flu while he'd waited to be demobbed, and Northamptonshire was full of hollowed-out villages and hollow-eyed men. So, like everyone else, he'd come to London to look for work, paying his way with his war gratuity and the little his mother had left him. He'd taken whatever jobs he could find, tramped the streets for hours making increasingly desperate applications, and realized with slow-mounting fear as the months passed that his slide into poverty was unstoppable, no matter how willing he was to work. He'd written to his unknown uncle when he'd reached the stage of rationing himself to 1 meal a day, and calculating when his shoe leather would wear quite through. He hadn't expected an answer, let alone a welcome. It had been a last throw of the dice, and he'd rolled a double 6. Uncle William had welcomed him as long-lost family, which alone would have made Will weak with thankfulness. But far more, he'd given him money and let him work to earn it. Will wouldn't have been able to repay that debt of gratitude in years. In the event, he'd only had a couple of months before the old man passed on, but at least he'd been there to care for him, make his final days as comfortable as they could be, ensure he didn't die alone. And now Will had an established business and an unmortgaged roof over his head, The change in his circumstances still made him dizzy. The thought of rates reminded him that a good way to deal with the towering oppression of books might be to sell some of them. He had several plans toward that end, including finding out what he owned, making the shop less cluttered and more attractive, seeking out buyers instead of waiting for them to arrive by chance, and overall not behaving like a gnome protecting his hoard, in contrast to every other second-hand book dealer he'd met so far. In pursuit of this aim, he picked up Norden on book dealing, found his page, and was skimming the chapter on music publishing when the door chime sounded. Will glanced up, pointlessly because the view of the door from the desk was obscured by bookshelves. That was something he'd change as soon as he'd worked out the logistics of shifting about 2 tons of books to do it. He could easily not see people who came in for a good half hour or even at all, since many browsers preferred to lurk out of sight. That had been deliberate on his uncle's part. He'd advised Will never to be a shop walker, pouncing on customers and bothering them. Will suspected that his uncle had preferred not to sell books if he could avoid doing so, and had been keen to take a more active approach. But when he tried greeting browsers, they mostly stared as if he'd made an indecent proposition, or panicked and fled. In truth, he had very little idea of where to find books on Oriental porcelain or the 100 Years' War in the chaos anyway, so he'd quickly given up. He swung his feet back off the desk as a sop to customer service, and went back to his book. Surprisingly, after a short hesitation, the footsteps came up to the desk. That suggested an initiative and sociability that were rare in his customers. Will looked up with a smile carefully adjusted not to seem too eager, and saw a man in his 40s, wearing a light mackintosh and a hard, silent, unsmiling expression. Eccentricity was rather the rule than the exception in Will's experience to date, so he didn't ask the fellow what he thought he was gulping at, but instead tried, "Good morning, sir. May I help you?" "William Darling?" "Yes," Will said cautiously. Oh, God, was it bailiffs? If he was being dunned on his uncle's behalf, that could tip his precarious financial balance disastrously. "What can I do for you?" "I want the information." "Not an overdue bill, then?" Will let out a long breath of relief. Good, excellent. I'm sure I can help. What information was that?" "The information. The word is daffodil." That was the strangest way Will could imagine of asking for a gardening book, but then this was a business where people thought it has a blue cover with sufficient description to identify any novel from the last 20 years. "A book on flowers? I'm sure I can help. Are you after something specific, or—" The man's expression hardened. "You know what I want." Doubtless he had written to Uncle William, and the letter had vanished into the papery abyss of his records. "Did you ask for it to be put aside?" Will hazarded. "Don't toy with me, Mr. Darling. The information was sent to you. I will pay you for it very generously. But I must, and will have it. Do you understand?" He understood the bit about generous payment. The rest was less clear. "I'll be delighted to help once I've grasped what you're after. Who is it by?" The man smacked his hand onto the desk, making the dust rise. It made Will rise as well, leaping to his feet in shock. "What the—" "I told you not to toy with me, you jumped-up shopkeeper." "I know you have it. Give it up. I will crush you underfoot." "Get out of my shop," Will said, "right now. I would not be spoken to like that. Who the devil do you think you are?" The man simply sneered. He was a few inches taller than Will, which put him over 6 foot, muscular and solidly built. The sort of man who wasn't often told where to get off. Today would be an exciting experience for him, then. Will skirted round the desk to face up to him, blood singing. "I said out. I don't have your damn daffodil book to my knowledge, and if I find it, I'll feel free to sell it to someone more civil. Go on, clear off." The man paused a second, arm muscles bulging. There was one slow tick of the clock during which Will was absolutely sure he was going to attack. And then he held up a hand, palm out. The action pulled back his coat sleeve and shirt cuff a little. "Take a moment to consider, Mr. Darling, before you make a very bad mistake. You would be well advised to think again. "About what? Sling your hook before I make you." "You will regret this," the man said in a growl. "Pretty sure I won't," Will told him, and stalked behind him until his peculiar visitor slammed the door on his way out. He stayed near the shop entrance a little while, pretending to tidy the shelves and watching for the fellow's return, and finally calmed down enough to laugh at himself. Throwing out a customer with money in his pocket. How quickly he'd adjusted to life as an antiquarian bookseller. It had been satisfying, but hardly the way to go if he wanted to keep eating. He got some very odd fish in here, and he couldn't evict them all. Still, he didn't need to swallow insults. You only had to do that when you were really hungry, and he had a packet of sausages in the back room waiting to go on the gas ring for lunch. A thought that drove the ill-mannered customer from his mind. He did some tidying up to kill time before that blessed hour, sold a few 3-shilling modern novels, plus a fine edition of Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome, for £2, 2 shillings and sixpence, and ate his sausages in the happy consciousness of a good morning's work. The afternoon brought another flurry of customers, all perfectly rational by bookshop standards, and by the time he went to bed he'd forgotten all about the ill-mannered man in the Mac. He woke in the middle of the night. 4 years of war had left him able to sleep through a bombardment, but primed to wake at the slightest hint of stealthy movement. A rat, say, or the human equivalent, trying to pinch his cigarettes. Will went from deep, dreamless sleep to open-eyed alertness in the pitch dark, and for a minute wasn't quite sure where he was, or why he couldn't hear the bustle of movement and distant thunder of guns. He was in the back room of the bookshop, of course. It had a door to the tiny yard and outhouse, a small window that looked onto the yard, and an internal door that opened on the shop floor. Will lay, first orienting himself, then trying to angle his hearing in the direction the sound had come from. As he strained his ears, he heard a very gentle but unmistakable riffle of paper. Someone was in the shop. He sat up and saw the faintest glimmer of light under the door. It wasn't from the street, since electric street lighting had yet to reach May's buildings. A moment more saw it flicker in a way that confirmed his suspicions. Someone was in his shop with a flashlight. Will swung himself silently out of bed, careful not to make the rickety frame creak. He was wearing sufficiently robust flannel pyjamas that he could be confident in going out. He'd have been even more confident with his service revolver. Instead, he groped for the knife he used for onions, and felt a brief nostalgia as he grasped the handle in the dark. It was just like old times. His uncle, in a rare burst of modernity, had had electricity put into the shop. There was a switch next to the back-room door. Will worked out his movements first, then eased the door handle round and the door open, and got his hand to the switch. He shut his eyes as he flicked it and kicked the door fully open. There was a shout of surprise, and an instant later a very familiar cascade of papery thumps. Will opened his eyes to see 2 men, both black-clad and masked. One had gone headlong over a pile of books, sending them and himself to the floor. The other, holding an electric flashlight, was trying to pull him up. "Hi, you! Get out!" Will bellowed and brandished the knife. He'd expected them to flee. Instead, to his utter astonishment, the standing burglar swung round, dropped into a defensive crouch, and whipped out a knife of his own. Who the hell came armed to rob a bookshop? Will dropped low, slicing out at the fellow's arm. His opponent blocked the attack while feinting with his own weapon, in a move practiced enough to make Will very unhappy at his makeshift weapon. The second man had now scrambled to his feet. Will shouted, "Thieves!" at the top of his voice, hoping to God there was a constable passing. He didn't want to take on 2 proficient fighters alone and in his pyjamas. The second man was retreating, though, and as he did, he snapped, "Come on!" The knife man lunged at Will again. Will twisted past the move and sliced through the cloth over the bastard's cheek with his little blade, missing the eye but eliciting a curse. The second man snapped a word that sounded vaguely foreign, though his accent was English, then added, "Now, damn you," in a commanding tone. The first turned reluctantly, and they both ran for the door. Will hurdled the spilled books and raced after them. They slammed the door in his face as they fled. He wrenched it open, setting the bell jangling wildly, to see them herring up the street. He followed for a few steps. Then his bare foot landed on something sharp, slicing the skin and making him stumble, slip, and fall badly on the wet, uneven road, cracking his knee. Jesus! He breathed down the variety of pains, hauled himself up, and looked around. The men were gone. May's Buildings was empty, dark, and still. If anyone had heard the racket, they weren't turning on the lights or coming out to help. He made his way back inside over the cold, wet pavement, limping and thinking. Will didn't find it easy to get back to sleep, and thus didn't approach the next morning with a great deal of grace. He went to the police station to report the break-in and spent an infuriating hour with the desk sergeant, who seemed to regard it as highly suspicious that he hadn't roamed the streets at 3 a.m. searching for a constable. Even more suspicious was Will's assertion that the lock had been picked rather than the door forced, leaving no damage, and that nothing to his knowledge had been stolen. "A burglary with no evidence of a break-in and nothing missing, Mr. Darling. Are you sure you didn't leave the door unlocked? No? Well, I'm afraid we're very busy here, but I'll ask someone to come round and take your statement in due course." Will requested firmly that he should give a statement at once for the record, and the whole tedious business took up nearly 2 hours of his morning. He returned to the shop to find a rude note from a customer outraged that he was closed, and another from a neighbour requesting that he refrain from raucous drunkenness in the small hours. After that he discovered that the tea-caddy was empty, so he had to go out again on his painfully cut foot, and overall he was in a decidedly poor state of mind by 3 o'clock. When the bell jangled, and 2 men approached his desk. Brass, was his instant thought. They wore suits and carried umbrellas, but he could tell Brass when he saw it, even in mufti. He knew an impulse to stand and salute, which he resisted. The first officer, gentleman rather, was in his 50s, with a little grey toothbrush moustache. The second was pink, round-faced, and curly-haired, which rather gave him the air of a large baby. "Mr. William Darling," the older said, "my name is Ingoldsby. This is Mr. Price. May I have a few minutes of your time?" "Certainly. What can I do for you?" Ingoldsby nodded to Price, who slipped away. Will raised a brow. "The door," Ingoldsby said. "This is a private conversation. Is there anyone else on the premises?" "Not unless I'm being burgled." "I heard about that." Ingoldsby looked around for a chair. With a little reluctance, Will removed a stack of books from the spare and gestured to him to sit down. "Thank you. As I said, I am Captain Charles Ingoldsby, and I am with the War Office." Will sat straight up at that, an automatic response. "Sir." "And I dare say you know what this is about." Will considered that from several angles. "No, sir, I don't." Ingoldsby's brows rose in that upper-class way they seemed to teach at Eton. "Really, Darling?" "That's Mr. Darling to you. I'm not in uniform," Will thought, but didn't quite say. "I have no idea. All I know—" "Hold on just a second. What do you mean you heard about my burglary?" "The War Office is interested in you for reasons that should be very obvious." "Well, why?" Ingoldsby shot him a scathing glance. "This is official business. You would be ill-advised to waste my time." "I've absolutely no idea what you're talking about. You'll have to explain." Ingoldsby huffed with irritation. "Draven's letter!" Will waited for more. It didn't come. "Oh? Stop playing the fool. You have corresponded with him for years. We know what he sent you. It is ours. We want it back, and your refusal to cooperate will have extremely serious consequences. Draven sent you a communication 6 weeks ago." "The information," Will said, light dawning at last. "This character Draven sent the information. Ingoldsby sat back, calming down a little. "Yes, the information. That is what I want, and at once." "Bad luck," Will said. "You've got the wrong darling." Ingoldsby took that in for an unblinking moment. "I beg your pardon?" "My uncle, Mr. William Darling, owned this place until he died a fortnight ago, Monday before last. I'd worked here for a few weeks before he was taken ill. I moved in to look after him when he had a stroke 10 days before his death. If Draven was communicating with a William Darling, it was him, not me. I'd never heard of the fellow, and I have no idea what he sent for, or less where it is." "You mentioned it. You know that it exists." "No, I don't know that. All I know is that you're not the first person to ask for it. I had a bad-tempered sort in here yesterday, demanding some sort of information with veiled threats. I thought he meant a book he'd ordered. He got very shirty about it, and as noted, I also had a burglary last night. 2 men who seemed to be searching my desk but didn't touch the petty cash box. One of them had a knife. What's all this about, Captain Ingoldsby?" "Can you describe the man you spoke to yesterday?" "About 6'1", perhaps, well-built, muscular, brown hair receding a little, light eyes, grey or blue, perhaps. And I'll bet he's got a shallow cut on his face where I caught him with a knife last night, because I'm pretty sure it was him burgling the place." "Your police report said the burglar was masked." Ingoldsby had read the report he'd filed just that morning. Will found that vaguely worrying. "He was, but he had the same build and pale eyes, and the man I spoke to yesterday had a little tattoo on the underside of his wrist where a watch strap might go." Will indicated the point on his own wrist. "I couldn't make out what it was. I only saw it for a second. Perhaps a sailboat? There was a triangular shape to it. But I definitely saw a tattoo in the same spot when I engaged with the enemy. The burglar, rather, last night." "Did you—" Ingoldsby sounded calm, but his eyes were far away. "Libra." The last word was almost under his breath. Will said, "What?" "No concern of yours." "It's my concern if he broke in here and pulled a knife on me, and Libra sounds like what the other man said to him. Isn't it the Latin for book?" Ingoldsby pressed his lips together in thought and didn't answer. That was becoming irritating. "This is very informative, but not the information I came for. Where is that?" "I told you I don't have the foggiest." "You must know." Ingoldsby sounded frustrated. "Did your uncle destroy any papers?" "If he did, it wasn't in my presence. He never asked me to destroy any papers for him." "Have you gone through his recent correspondence?" "Only to look for bills and orders. I've a job on to get this place sorted out." Ingoldsby took a slow survey of the shop, a sneer raising his upper lip and Will's hackles. "So I see. We can save you that task." "Sorry?" "My men will search your uncle's correspondence and all private papers. If they don't find it there, they will have to extend the search. Considering the conditions of this establishment, we may well need to take charge of the property until it's found. You should go to a hotel." "Right, good idea," Will said. "Just one thing. Where's your warrant?" "I beg your pardon?" "Warrant, Magna Carta, remember? You don't just walk in here and tell me you'll be going through my private papers. We've got laws in this country." Ingoldsby sighed pointedly. "There is no need for a warrant if you grant your permission for the search to take place." "Why should I do that?" "As a soldier, darling, you should understand that some orders must be given without explanation and obeyed without question. This is one of those." "I remember those orders," Will said. "They usually killed a lot of men, and by the way, I'm not a soldier anymore, and it's Mr. Darling, thank you. Come back with a warrant and I'll have a look at it." "Do you—" Ingoldsby cut himself off. "Let me impress on you, Mr. Darling, that this is a matter of grave importance. The War Office needs this information." "But you won't tell me what it is, or why?" "It's a classified matter." "So you want me to take your word for it and hand over my business without explanation?" Will was extremely angry, he realized, so angry he could feel the tremor in his muscles. "We aren't at war anymore. I have rights." "Are you a socialist, Mr. Darling? An anarchist?" Will almost laughed. "Oh, here we go. If I don't do exactly what you say, I must be trying to bring down the state. No, I'm not an anarchist. I believe in the rule of law and the rights of an Englishman's home to be his castle, which is more than you seem to do, because this is my home and the papers you want to search are my property. You have no right to walk in here and demand them." "I have a need. Your country has a need, and as a soldier I would expect you to extend every assistance." "For crying out loud," Will said. "Me uncle was an antiquarian bookseller. What possible information could he have had? No, don't tell me it's classified, he added before Ingoldsby could say it himself. If you share your information with me, I'll consider sharing mine with you. If not, you can come back with a warrant from a judge once you've explained to him why you're entitled to search the house of a private citizen who isn't suspected of any wrongdoing. Now, the door's over there. I have a business to run. He enjoyed ushering Ingoldsby out. He'd been a working part in the state machine for years, a tool to be used, easily replaceable if he broke. He hadn't particularly minded it at the time. There was a job to be done, one at which he'd proved rather good. But he wasn't a tool any more, and he was damned if he'd be put back in that box without a by your leave. It felt less good by nightfall as he locked up. He'd added bolts to the door as part of his day's work, but there were no shutters to stop anyone who wanted to smash a window. He didn't have a gun and rather regretted that. What he did have at the bottom of his box was a German Nahkampfmesser, a trench knife with an 8-inch blade and a nicely carved wooden grip that its previous owner had put a lot of effort into. Will had taken it off that owner once he was no longer in a position to use it. The German army had issued damn good knives, and it was a lot better than the sharpened barbed wire stakes or cut-down bayonets his battalion had been reduced to. It brought the Messer back to Blighty, and it was one of the few possessions he'd never pawned. That wasn't a sentimental attachment. He'd known he'd want it if he ended up on the streets. He dug the Messer out now, making a note to find a knife grinder to put a better edge on it, and placed it by his bed in its leather sheath. It seemed mildly ridiculous as a precaution, but the whole business was absurd. What had Uncle William to do with the War Office, or with the sort of men who threatened and burgled? Will would have assumed the whole thing was a mistake, except that Ingoldsby had unquestionably recognized the description he'd given of the man with the wrist tattoo. It had to be a misunderstanding. Anyone who'd had dealings with the War Office knew exactly how shambolic they could be. Probably Uncle William was this Draven chap's old school chum, and the missing communication would turn out to be a Christmas card. He told himself that. But he still lay awake until the small hours, listening to every creak and rustle. Chapter 2. Will went to see his friend Maisie Jones the next day. Maisie was a smart young lady with a lilting Welsh accent. They'd met when Will got a job fetching and carrying for her previous employer, and struck up a conversation over their un-London voices. Maisie had left Cardiff after the Tiger Bay race riots, seeing no more future there than Will had in Northamptonshire. Though neither had found London's streets paved with gold, she was round-faced and bright-eyed, with brown skin, black hair ruthlessly marcelled into waves, a quick mind, and a smile that lit rooms. Will had asked her dancing early on in their acquaintance, and they'd had some very pleasant evenings. Then he had walked into a storeroom at work and found the senior shop-floor clerk trapping her there. He'd removed the man without ceremony, using his boot, and been summarily dismissed. That had put a stop to dancing, because he'd had to save his pennies and his shoe leather. It had also changed his relations with Maisie over the months that followed. She'd refused to let him slip out of sight, demanded he come round for tea, bought him meals when he'd accept them, pressed him to accept a loan of 10 shillings that kept a doss-house roof over his head in a week of desperation, and bullied him into writing to his long-estranged uncle. That last had changed his life. He'd set any thought of romance firmly aside. It was bad enough to be scrounging off her without being a bloody gigolo about it. And they'd come to be friends in a way you couldn't be with a girl if your intention was to get her on her back. That was a pity in its way, because Will liked her a great deal. But friendship was no sort of second best in this lonely, teeming city. Maisie worked at a milliner's on Lexington Street, which had a fancy French name and served women who, she said, needed to look at exciting hats while they bought boring ones. He waited for her to come out at lunchtime, took her to a Lion's Corner house, and launched into his story. Maisie listened, frowning. "What an extraordinary business. Have you searched for this paper or letter or whatever it is?" "I started going through my uncle's correspondence this morning. The problem is I don't know what I'm trying to find, and my uncle left more paper than you can shake a stick at. There's boxes and boxes with letters just thrown in any old hour, and I moved a lot of it around to make space to sleep in when I was taking care of him,